Somebody sat on a riverbank in Idaho 15,700 years ago and carved a weapon designed to spin. That should not be possible. The road they were supposed to have walked in on was still buried under ice. 14 pieces of stone. None of them longer than your finger. Some no bigger than a thumbnail. Scientists put them under a 3D scanner and measured every curve, every bevel, every edge, down to fractions of a millimeter. Then they dated the charcoal from the dirt they came out of. 15,785 years. That made them the oldest weapons ever found anywhere in the Americas. Then a researcher laid a photograph of them beside a photograph of stone points excavated on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, in northern Japan. They were the same shape, and nobody has been able to explain how. Let me show you what these things actually are, because the size of them is the first shock. They are called western stemmed points. One end is a blade. The other end tapers into a narrow stem, cut so the point could be lashed onto a shaft. Most are between ½ inch and 2 inches long. One cataloged example measures 65 millimeters end to end, 19 millimeters across, and less than 5 millimeters thick. It weighs 5.8 grams, less than a coin. They were not spear tips. They were dart points, thrown with a throwing stick. And there is one detail in them that stops most people who study stone tools. The blades were deliberately given a twist. A single bevel worked along one edge, so the whole point rotates in flight and turns as it enters the body of an animal. That is not decoration, that is engineering. Somebody worked out that a spinning blade does more damage than a straight one. Then they built that into a piece of stone the weight of a paperclip, roughly 15,700 years ago. The place they came out of sits in western Idaho, where Rock Creek runs into the lower Salmon River. On a map, it is a low terrace above the water. Federal land now, managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Archaeologists call it Cooper's Ferry. That is not its name. Its name is Nepehee. It is a Nimiipu village, the Nez Perce, and it appears in their oral history not as a ruin, but as a founding. A young couple whose home was destroyed by a flood came here and started again. Hold on to that detail. It comes back at the end of this story in a way that is genuinely uncomfortable. For now, just notice the arrangement. The oldest weapons ever found in the Americas came out of the ground at a place that already had a name, and already had a story about why people first stopped here. There is something about these points that almost nobody reports. They had already been dug up, 60 years ago. In 1961, an archaeologist named B. Robert Butler opened this terrace and pulled stemmed points out of the ground. He came back in 1962. He came back again in 1964. He found them stacked in proper layers, one above another, exactly where they should be if nothing had ever disturbed them. He wrote them up, he put them in boxes, and then they sat. For 6 decades, the oldest weapons in the Americas were on a shelf, catalogued, labeled, sitting in the dark in a storage room, while every textbook in the country printed the wrong date. Nobody hid them, nobody destroyed them. The instruments that could read them simply did not exist yet. Radiocarbon dating was crude. It needed large samples. It could not be run on the objects themselves. There was no way to scan the inside of anything, no way to model a date range statistically. So the discovery had already happened. The proof was 60 years late. And this is the part that should unsettle you. That storage room is not unusual. Every major museum in the world has one. The ground gives up the evidence long before anyone can read it. In 1997, an anthropologist from Oregon State University named Lauren Davis went back to the terrace. He found non-Clovis points and dated them to around 13,300 years. Old, not impossible. The field could absorb that. He came back in 2009 and stayed until 2018, 9 field seasons. Oregon State, working alongside the Bureau of Land Management, with Nez Perce archaeologists and Nez Perce interns digging beside the university crews. This was not a backhoe operation, string grids, meter squares, everything photographed in place before it was lifted, sediment screened, charcoal bagged by layer. And between 2012 and 2017, the points started coming out. 13 of them, complete and broken, sitting together in a pit, not scattered across a floor, grouped, placed. Somebody buried 13 weapons in a pit on purpose, and then never came back for them. Nobody knows why. There is no injury to point to, no burnt layer, no sign of anyone leaving in a hurry. Just a set of tools somebody meant to collect, still waiting. And notice the direction this site keeps moving in. In 1961, nobody could date it. In 1997, it came back at 13,300 years. In 2019, 16,000. In 2022, the points themselves landed at 15,785 and became the oldest in the hemisphere. Every time somebody returns to this terrace with a better instrument, the date gets older. The points were not alone, and this is where the site stops being a scatter of stone and starts being a place where people lived. The excavation recovered several hundred artifacts. In one published count, 189 stone pieces, of which 27 were finished tools, blades, biface fragments, flake tools. There was charcoal, there was fire-cracked rock, stone heated until it splits, which only happens around a fire that burned for a long time. There was a hearth, there was a food processing station, there were pits dug into the ground for storage. And there were 86 fragments of animal bone. In 3 of those pits, the team found something that mattered more than all of it. A tooth fragment from an extinct horse, Equus, an animal that died out in North America at the end of the last ice age. That single tooth makes Cooper's Ferry the oldest radiocarbon-dated site in North America where human tools sit alongside the bones of animals that no longer exist. Somebody was here, cooking, storing food, butchering an animal that has been gone for over 10,000 years. Now the part that made this a headline. When Davis and his team went looking for anything else in the world shaped like these points, they did not find it in the American Southwest. They did not find it on the Great Plains, where Clovis was defined. They found it in Hokkaido, northern Japan, across the Pacific. Stemmed points from the late Upper Paleolithic, made before the Jomon period, dated somewhere between roughly 16 and 20,000 years ago, older than the Idaho points. Some estimates put the Japanese examples at 19 to 20,000 years. Same narrow stem, same tapered blade, same solution to the same problem. Davis has been direct about what he thinks it means. In his words, the findings refute the hypothesis of the ice-free corridor and support the idea that people came down the Pacific coast instead. One possibility he has raised is that you are looking at the cultural extension of people carrying these ideas with them from northern Japan. Sit with the scale of that for a second. A tool design, moving across the top of the Pacific, down a coastline that no longer exists, into a river valley in Idaho. And now the objection, because there is a good one. The strongest critic of this site is an archaeologist named Ben Potter at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I want to give his argument properly, because it is not a dismissal. It is a technical problem, and it is a real one. Potter's position is that the similarity between the Idaho points and the Japanese points is superficial. Here is why that matters. A stone toolkit is not one object, it is a set. And the sites in ancient Japan that produce these stemmed points also produce something else, microblades. Small, thin, standardized blades struck off a prepared core, made in enormous numbers. They are one of the defining signatures of that entire tradition. Microblades are not at Cooper's Ferry. They are not anywhere else in North America at that period either. So Potter's argument is simple. If a group of people carried this technology across the Pacific, they should have carried the whole kit. Instead, you have one shape that looks similar and the rest of the package missing. And a stemmed point is not a complicated shape. Take a piece of stone, make one end sharp, narrow the other end so it can be tied to a stick. People in completely unconnected parts of the world have arrived at that shape independently, over and over, because it works. Potter has raised a second objection too, and it is harder. He argues the material in those pits is too jumbled to link the tools conclusively to the animal bones being dated. Honestly, if I were reviewing that paper, that is the question I would ask. But here is what keeps the argument alive, and it has nothing to do with Japan at all. It is a timing problem, and it is brutal. The textbook story required an ice-free corridor, a gap opening between 2 enormous ice sheets in Canada, letting people walk south from Alaska into the rest of the continent. Studies suggest that corridor began to open around 14,800 years ago, but opening is not the same as usable. There was no reliable food in it, no established plant and animal life, nothing to sustain a group walking 1,000 miles through it. Most estimates say it did not become a survivable route until after 13,000 years ago. Cooper's Ferry is dated to 15,785. Do the arithmetic. People were sitting at that river in Idaho, cooking food and caching weapons, before the road they supposedly walked in on was passable. Potter does not fully concede this. He argues the corridor may have been traversable by 15,000 years ago, and that writing off the interior route is premature. But the number is the number, and the number arrived first. Which brings this back to the name. While the field argued about corridors and coastlines and Japanese microblades, there was a group of people who had never been confused about how long anyone had been at that river. Nakia Williamson is the Nez Perce tribe's director of cultural resources. When the results were published, his response was not excitement. His words were, "Our stories already tell us how long we've been here. This only reaffirms that." Read that again, slowly. The oldest weapons ever found in the Americas were pulled out of a village whose descendants were standing at the edge of the excavation, whose oral history had been saying, for generations, that their people had been there from the beginning. Nez Perce archaeologists and Nez Perce interns worked those grids. They were not consulted at the end, they were in the trench. And Williamson has been clear about what he hopes comes out of it. Not a headline, recognition of how deep the tie between his people and that ground actually runs. The science took 60 years and 2 institutions to arrive somewhere the story had already been sitting for a very long time. I need to be straight about what this does and does not prove, because the internet has already run further with it than the evidence allows. This is not proof that Japanese people settled America. Nobody serious is claiming that. Ancient DNA from the earliest Americans points consistently to Northeast Asia. What Davis is proposing is far narrower, that a way of making a tool traveled, carried by populations moving around the northern Pacific Rim across thousands of years, and that some of those populations eventually came south along the coast. That is a claim about knowledge moving, not about a boat from Japan. And here is the part that makes it almost impossible to settle. If people came down that coastline, the coastline is gone. Sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. The beaches they would have walked are underwater now. The evidence that would close this argument is offshore, in the dark, under 100 meters of ocean. It is worth stopping to picture the terrace, because once you do, the site explains itself. A flat bench of dry ground above a river, at the exact point where a creek comes in, above the flood line, clear sight lines up and down the water, salmon running below, stone for tools available within a day's walk. The material at the site was carried in from about 16 kilometers away. It is a good place to stop. It was a good place to stop 15,000 years ago, and it was still a good place to stop when the Nepehee were living there in the last few centuries. Nobody built a monument here. People kept arriving at the same sensible bend in a river, made camp, worked a little stone, ate, and left something behind. Nepehee is not really a site. It is the same good idea, repeated for 15,000 years. The points are real. The date is real. The extinct horsetooth is real. The Japan connection is a resemblance, and a resemblance is not a road. Somewhere in a collection in the Pacific Northwest, 14 pieces of worked stone sit in trays, each one lighter than a coin, each one carrying a twist that somebody cut into it on purpose so that it would spin. They were dug up in the 1960s and nobody could read them. They were dug up again after 2009, and this time the instruments existed. 60 years of being right and unprovable. And the thing that would finish this argument, the beaches those people walked, is under the Pacific, where no shovel reaches. The oldest weapons in the Americas are on a shelf in Idaho. The road they came in on is under the sea.